Hey guys, tonight we are standing by the edge of the waves. The air is damp, cool, and just a little salty, drifting across your skin as if the sea itself is brushing past you. It's dark, but the ocean keeps whispering against the shore, steady, as your heartbeat, reminding you that the world is far older and stranger than anything you read in a textbook. Out beyond the horizon lies mystery upon mystery, whole worlds swallowed by time. And tonight, we're stepping right into one of the greatest legends of them all, the story of Atlantis. Imagine this: an entire island kingdom larger than Libya and Asia combined, blessed with riches, dazzling architecture, and technology that supposedly made other nations look like they were still fumbling with stone tools. It's the kind of place where streets glitter with orichalcum, temples rise higher than skyscrapers, and elephants casually stroll around as if they're neighborhood cats. Sounds perfect, right? Little too perfect. Which, of course, is usually when the universe says, okay, you're having too much fun, let's fix that. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this particular story if you were actually there. But before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time down in the comments. I love seeing where you're listening from. It feels like all of us are gathered around the same giant bonfire, only with fewer marshmallows and more mythology. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hear the surf again, steady, ancient, as if it's hiding secrets under its breath. Because that's where Atlantis begins, not in some forgotten ruin, but in words, specifically in the words of one very chatty Greek philosopher, Plato, around 360 BCE. Plato sat down and decided to tell a story about a place no one else had mentioned before. A glittering island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles. What? You know today as the Strait of Gibraltar. According to him, Atlantis had once been a powerful force that threatened Athens itself, only to be destroyed in a single catastrophic day and night. Now, here's the fun part. Plato never claimed he invented this story outright. Instead, he insisted that it was passed down from Egyptian priests to the Athenian statesman Solon, who then shared it with his descendants until Plato wrote it down. So you're left wondering, was Plato spinning a grand allegory about pride and punishment, or was he actually preserving a scrap of very ancient history? Historians still argue whether he was just flexing his storytelling muscles, or whether there's a kernel of truth hidden in there. You picture him in his toga, probably sipping watered wine and smirking as he dropped this tale into his dialogues. On one hand, he could be teaching a lesson. Don't get cocky, Athens, or the gods will smack you down. On the other hand, maybe he had heard rumors of real disasters, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, Van stitched them together into a cautionary epic. And honestly, if you were living in ancient Greece, it wouldn't take much imagination to dream up a civilization that got flattened overnight. Nature was already throwing tantrums left and right. But here's where the mystery hooks you. Atlantis wasn't described as just some dusty little fishing town. It was wealthy, organized, and ridiculously advanced. The Atlanteans supposedly built concentric rings of land and sea, with canals slicing through like something out of a futuristic city plan. If you're picturing Venice, but bigger, shinier, and with elephants wandering around, yeah, that's the vibe. It's almost like Plato was describing a utopia, the kind of place where everyone else on Earth would look up and go, okay, that's not fair. And maybe that's the point. Human beings have always loved telling stories about perfect golden ages, lost Edens, hidden Shangri-La cities of gold buried under jungles. Atlantis is just the Greek version of that same old itch, the longing for a world where things were easier, cleaner, shinier. You might even compare it to scrolling Instagram late at night. Everyone else seems to have flawless lives. And you're sitting there with potato chips on your chest, wondering where you went wrong. Atlantis is like the ultimate Instagram flex from the ancient world. Still, you can't ignore that Plato gave some oddly specific details. Distances, measurements, resources, even the mention of elephants, which wasn't exactly the go-to animal for Greeks to casually throw into myths. And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. One of the metals he name-dropped was orichalcum. Sounds fancy, right? For centuries, people thought it was purely fictional until divers off the coast of Sicily actually found ancient ingots stamped with the word. Historians still argue whether orichalcum was really just brass or a special copper alloy, but suddenly, this shiny detail from Plato's story didn't seem quite so imaginary. So you're left with a puzzle. Was Plato carefully weaving an allegory? Or was he preserving fragments of some much older memory, a civilization erased by nature's fury? And if that's the case, how much of his story was true, and how much was creative embellishment? These questions have haunted thinkers for over 2,000 years. You can almost hear the ocean chuckling softly beside you, like it knows the answer but refuses to say. You stay with the sound of the waves. But now you're leaning closer to the source of the story itself, the pages where it all began. Picture this: Athens, about 360 BCE. Marble columns still gleaming under Mediterranean sunlight. And a philosopher named Plato scribbling down a pair of dialogues. He calls them Timaeus and Critias. To his students, they were just another lesson in politics, morality, and how humans mess things up when they get too comfortable. To us, they became the birth certificate of Atlantis. In Timaeus, Plato casually drops the bombshell. He doesn't even make it the main topic hits, like that one friend who slips gossip into conversation, while pretending it's no big deal. He claims Solon, one of Athens' most respected lawgivers, traveled to Egypt around 600 BCE there. Egyptian priests supposedly told him of a mighty island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which once tried to conquer the Mediterranean world. They failed, were defeated by Athens. Yes, of course, Athens plays the hero. And then Atlantis vanished beneath the waves in a single day and night. Boom! End scene. Except Plato wasn't done. In Critias, he digs deeper, layering the story with juicy details. You hear of an island arranged in concentric circles, rings of land and water woven together, like a labyrinth you could sail through. There are palaces clad in shining metals, temples bigger than football stadiums, and yes, herds of elephants strolling about like they owned the place. The Atlanteans mined orichalcum, farmed fertile plains, and built a navy that could outclass anyone. It's basically the ancient Greek equivalent of saying, these guys had Wi-Fi while everyone else was still lighting torches. But here's the kicker. Plato doesn't wrap it up neatly. Krios breaks off mid-sentence as if the philosopher got distracted, lost the manuscript, or just said, "Hey, I'll finish it later." Spoiler, he never did. So you're left with half a Mathon incomplete cliffhanger that has tortured curious minds ever since. Imagine binge-watching a season of your favorite show and then discovering the finale never got filmed. That's what Plato did to humanity. Historians still argue whether Plato intended the whole thing as a moral allegory. Maybe Atlantis was never meant to be real at all, but simply a cautionary tale about hubris and decline. Remember, this was a guy who loved using metaphors the way kids love candy. His allegory of the cave wasn't about actual caves, and shadows. It was about perception and truth. So maybe Atlantis was the same flashy metaphor for societies that grow too greedy, too arrogant, and eventually collapse. Still, something about the way he wrote it feels different. Unlike myths about Zeus turning into a swan, yeah? Ancient Greece had some weird hobbies. Plato packed Atlantis with technical detail. Distances, measures, topography, crops, and even the layout of harbors. He didn't just say a big fancy island sank. He handed you a blueprint. And that level of specificity has a funny way of making people wonder, why bother unless you're basing it on something? Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some scholars noticed that the timeline Plato gave, 9,000 years before Solanwood Place, Atlantis around 9,600 BCE, that happens to brush up against the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were rising dramatically, swallowing coastlines all over the world. Coincidence? Maybe. But you can see why people's eyebrows went straight up. And it doesn't help that humans have short memories. Floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, they all happen. But after a few generations, the details blur. And soon you're telling why died. Kids that your great-great-grandfather's town was swallowed by the sea. Multiply that across thousands of years, and it's easy to imagine how Plato might have picked up on an echo of a very real catastrophe. Of course, others push back. Maybe he made the 9,000 years number ridiculously huge on purpose, like when someone says, "I waited 1,000,000 years for the bus." Historians still argue whether those numbers were symbolic, mistranslated, or just Plato being dramatic. After all, the man was writing philosophy, not keeping a geological journal. Yet the allure lingers. You can almost see Plato sitting with his students, reading aloud the tale of Atlantis, watching their eyes widen and quietly smirking to himself. Was he laughing at how easily they bought it? Or was he nudging them toward some half-remembered truth, daring them to dig deeper? Either way, he succeeded in planting a seed that would outlast marble temples and even Athens itself, and Uyur. Leaning in, hearing the rustle of parchment, the flicker of an oil lamp, and the hum of a philosopher's voice shaping a mystery that still hasn't faded. You're still perched beside those waves. But now your imagination slips through Plato's half-finished pages and into the city itself. Atlantis he described so vividly that it almost feels like you could book a cheap weekend flight there. You step onto wide roads paved with stone, feeling the hum of a place that's not just alive, but thriving on a scale few in the ancient world could have. Imagine the first thing you notice is water. Everywhere, canals gleam in the sunlight, looping around the city in neat concentric rings, crossing over with bridges that rise like stone rainbows. Ships glide along them effortlessly, their sails catching ocean breezes while the people stroll across bridges above. You look down and see fish darting through the water, then glance up to notice elephants lumbering in from the field's ears, flapping like sails of their own. Because yes, according to Plato, the Atlanteans had elephants giant, tusked reminders that this island was overflowing with resources. At the center of it all sits a dazzling temple to Poseidon, the sea god, credited with creating the place in the first place. It's colossal, clad in precious metals with statues of horses and gods gleaming in the sun. Orichalcum, that half-mythical metal, shimmers across the walls. Imagine the way sunlight must have bounced from one polished surface to another, until the whole temple glittered like a disco ball of the Bronze Age. Somewhere, an Atlantean architect probably thought, yes, more shine, please. While their accountant wept quietly in the background, you stroll through the city and notice how carefully organized it feels. Farms stretch across fertile plains that always seem watered just right. Crops sway in perfect rows, and herds of animals graze on lush grass. It's like Atlantis had a master planner who understood not just beauty, but practicality. And of course, being human, they didn't stop at enough. They pushed for more, bigger, better. Their navy was massive, hundreds of ships ready to sail beyond the horizon. Their army, trained and organized, prepared to flex power across the seas. Historians still argue whether Plato was describing a real society or just sketching a what-if Athens on steroids scenario. After all, he gave his Atlanteans the kind of traits Greeks admired: clever engineering, devotion to God's prosperity. But then he also warned about their eventual arrogance and greed. It's like he built them up as the ultimate role model, only to yank the rug out from under them. Classic philosopher moves set up a utopia, then crush it to make your point. Still, some details feel tantalizingly real. The mention of elephants, for instance. Not exactly common in Greek myth, but very real in North Africa and parts of Asia. Did Plato toss them in for flair? Or was he echoing faint whispers of a culture that actually had access to them? You can't help but raise an eyebrow. Here's your quirky tidbit. One of Atlantis' most catching features was its use of hot and cold springs. Plato describes them bubbling up in abundance, feeding baths and fountains. Imagine walking through a marble plaza where steam curls from one pool while another gushes with fresh, cool water. Basically, they invented the spa resort thousands of years before your local wellness center started charging $200 for a mud wrap. And yet, for all its perfection, you sense the cracks forming. Utopias always come with fine print. The Atlanteans were strong. Yes, but power breeds pride. Wealth leads to greed. And according to Plato, over time, they drifted from the virtues that had made them great. Instead of honoring Poseidon, they got lazy, selfish, and a little too high on their own supply of glory. Think of it this way. Atlantis was like that friend who wins the lottery. At first, it's great they buy everyone pizza, throw parties, maybe even fix up the neighborhood. But give it a few years, and suddenly they're bankrupt because they bought 10 sports cars, 3 giraffes, and a solid gold bathtub. That was Atlantis. Brilliant, rich, but heading for a crash. You glance around this gleaming city, hearing laughter echo down polished streets, smelling bread from bakeries that use flour ground on water-powered mills, and watching children chase each other along canal paths. Everything looks timeless, eternal. But if Plato's story is to be believed, this paradise has only a little time left before the gods decide they've seen enough. The waves outside your imagination remind you utopias may be beautiful, but they're fragile. And in Atlantis, the clock was already ticking. The hum of Atlantis is still in your ears, its canals, its laughter, its glittering temples, but the scene begins to tilt, as if the ground itself is sighing under the weight of what's coming. You know the saying, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And Plato doesn't give you a gentle collapse. He hands you a thunderous, cinematic ending where nature itself throws a tantrum and wipes the slate clean. The downfall begins, at least in the story, not with the sea, but with the people. Remember how Poseidon was supposed to be the protector of Atlantis, the god who gave the island its order and prosperity? Well, over time, the Atlanteans stopped living by his rules. They grew arrogant, greedy, and drunk on their own success. Instead of balance, they wanted domination. Instead of gratitude, they wanted glory. It's the kind of character arc you've seen 1,000 times in movies. Someone gets everything they've dreamed of, then spirals into self-destruction. Plato just hit fast forward on the moral lesson, so the gods convened. According to the myth, Zeus called a meeting on high and basically said, "Okay, time for a divine intervention." Sadly, Plato's account cuts off before he writes the speech itself. He leaves you hanging right when Zeus is about to drop the hammer, but he does. Tell us what happens next. Atlantis, in a single day and night, is swallowed by earthquakes, floods, and fire. One moment, you're standing on polished marble, admiring fountains. The next, you're clinging to a rooftop as waves roar through the streets. Picture it. The concentric canals that once made the city beautiful suddenly act like trapdoors, funneling seawater into the heart of Atlantis. Bridges snap, ships crash into each other. Elephants stampede in terror, their trumpeting drowned by the roar of the sea. Temples that glittered with orichalcum are ripped apart like sandcastles in the surf, and then it's gone. No long, slow decline. Just one catastrophic day where nature decides, game over. Historians still argue whether Plato's destruction scene was inspired by real disasters. Ancient Greece had no shortage of them: volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, earthquakes. In fact, entire towns had vanished before his time. So maybe he wasn't just making up divine punishment. Maybe he was remixing the collective trauma of people who'd watched their worlds literally sink. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Greek city of Helike really did vanish almost overnight. Around 373 BCE, just a few decades before Plato wrote his Dialogues, Helike was swallowed by an earthquake and tsunami, leaving only a lagoon where houses and temples had once stood. Travelers later reported seeing statues beneath the water, as if the city were haunting the sea. Plato's audience probably remembered hell like vividly. Atlantis may have sounded less like fantasy and more like déjà vu. And yet, Atlantis is not described as just another town lost to bad luck. It was the grandest of civilizations, punished not just by chance, but by the gods themselves. That's what made the story stick. The drama of divine justice. You can almost hear Plato leaning back and saying, "See what happens when you let arrogance run wild?" It's like the world's oldest "don't fly too close to the sun" meme. Except instead of Icarus melting his wings, you get a whole countenance sinking beneath the waves. And here's where the storytelling genius kicks in. Destruction is always memorable. You don't forget the fall of Rome, the eruption of Vesuvius, or the sinking of the Titanic. Atlantis sits in that same category, except it's wrapped in enough mystery that no one can fact-check it, which makes it all the more tantalizing. You stand there in your imagination, watching Atlantis disappear beneath the foam. The screams fading, the sea bubbling where palaces once stood. Then silence. Just waves again, as if nothing had ever been there. It's eerie, isn't it? The way the ocean covers its secrets so completely. You can almost hear it chuckle. What city? I don't remember any city. And that's how Plato leaves you with an empty horizon and a question mark. Did a real Atlantis drown somewhere out there? Or was it always just a lesson dressed in marble and myth? The gods may have had their judgment, but the mystery was only beginning. You're still listening to that eerie silence after the waves have swallowed Atlantis, but the quiet doesn't last. Instead, new voices start to echo: Greek voices, philosopher voices, the kind that never seem to agree on anything. Because once Plato dropped his story of Atlantis into the world, it didn't just vanish beneath the sea. It started rippling through the gossip mill of ancient thought. Think of it like this. Plato tells the tale, and suddenly every thinker in Athens has an opinion. Some leaned forward, intrigued, scribbling notes and wondering if their teacher had just revealed a hidden slice of history. Others roll their eyes, muttering, "There he goes again, making up islands." After all, Plato was notorious for using metaphors to sneak in his moral lessons. If you're the kind of person who argued about shadows in caves, you're not above inventing a whole drowned continent to make a point. Aristotle, Plato's star pupil, supposedly wasn't impressed. He reportedly brushed off Atlantis as just another metaphor, like saying, "Don't eat too much honey or you'll get sick." Ancient Greek health advice was creative. For Aristotle, if you couldn't measure it, poke it, or categorize, it probably didn't exist. And if there was no island visible beyond the Pillars of Heracles, then case closed. Atlantis was just a story, but others weren't so quick to dismiss it. Philosophers, historians, and storytellers kept chewing on Plato's tale, reshaping it, debating it. Some tried to link it to known events, like wars with the Persians or older myths of floods. Others took it as gospel, insisting that somewhere out there was a sunken world waiting to be rediscovered. Historians still argue whether Plato's audience even believed him at the time, or whether they simply enjoyed the drama the way we binge-watch a disaster movie. Here's a quirky tidbit. Even the playwright Euripides, decades earlier, had hinted at mysterious lands beyond the ocean. He wrote about Atlanteans in one of his lost plays. Though no one knows if he was imagining the same thing Plato later described, or just throwing out exotic-sounding names. It's like hearing two different kids on a playground talk about a monster under the bed. You start to wonder if they're making it up, or if they both heard a creak in the night. The thing is, the Greeks loved blending history with myth. To them, the line between true and symbolic was blurrier than the morning after a wine festival. Herodotus, often called the father of history, was known for including gossip, rumors, and outright tall tales in his writings. So if someone like Plato spun a story about a lost island, most listeners wouldn't automatically demand GPS coordinates. They'd nod thoughtfully and ask, "Okay, but what's the lesson here?" And maybe that's why the Atlantis myth stuck. Because, whether you thought it was real or fake, it carried weight. It was about hubris, downfall, the fragility of human achievement. You could read it as a parable or as a half-remembered history, and either way, it made you think. Still, you can't help picturing those ancient dinner parties where the debate raged. One philosopher swirling his cup of watered wine, insisting, No, it was real. My cousin's friend's uncle swore he saw ruins off the coast. Another snorting into his beard, saying, "Come on, it's just Plato being Plato." A third leaning in, whispering, "But what if it's both?" That question, the what if, is what kept Atlantis alive. Because once the idea is out, they're all. Grand lost civilization swallowed by the sea, you can't unhear it. It clings to you like the smell of the ocean, impossible to shake. And as the centuries rolled forward, the arguments kept echoing, each generation adding its own spin. Like beachcombers tossing new shells onto the same old pile. You sit with the thought, waves murmuring in your ears again, and realize whether Atlantis was a metaphor, a memory, or just a philosopher's bedtime story. The gossip it stirred was almost as important as the tale itself. The real city may or may not have existed, but the conversation never sank. The chatter of philosophers fades, and now you drift forward in time, watching centuries stretch like ripples across the sea. Atlantis hasn't sunk from memory, just been copied, recopied, and retold so many times that the story itself begins to change. Think of it like playing the world's longest game of telephone, except the message is written on fragile scrolls, translated by monks with bad handwriting, and passed between people who occasionally spill wine on the parchment. By the time it reaches the Renaissance, you're not sure if Plato would even recognize his own tale. Here's the reality. Almost everything we know about Atlantis comes from just a handful of ancient manuscripts. No big stone inscriptions. Number? Egyptian hieroglyphs confirming Plato's claims. Just 2 Greek dialogues preserved through painstaking hand-copying across centuries. And as you can imagine, humans aren't exactly flawless at copy this exactly as written. Sometimes words got blurred. Sometimes numbers shifted. Sometimes scribes decided to help by tweaking phrasing so it made more sense to them. The result? Story that was already mysterious became even murkier. Take Plato's timeline. Remember how he claimed Atlantis fell 9,000 years before Solon's time? That's around 9,600 BC, long before most historians believe organized civilizations even existed. Some scholars think that number might have been a translation hiccup, with hundreds mistakenly written as thousands. If that's true, then Atlantis' downfall might have been just 900 years earlier, instead of 9,000. Huge difference. Historians still argue whether this was an honest scribal error, a deliberate exaggeration, or simply Plato being dramatic again. Here's a quirky tidbit. Ancient Greek numbers weren't written like ours. They used letters of the alphabet, sometimes with marks above them, which makes it ridiculously easy to confuse one digit with another. Imagine writing 1000 as just a single letter, and a squiggle suddenly one ink smudge changes the whole timeline. It's like sending your rent money to the wrong Venmo account because you mistyped a username by one letter. And it wasn't just numbers. The actual geography of Atlantis has been bent out of shape over the centuries. Copyists struggled with Plato's detailed descriptions of canals, plains, and mountain ranges. Words slipped, spellings shifted. What started as 3,000 stadia, an ancient measure of distance, might get garbled into something totally different. Suddenly, the island isn't just big, it's impossibly gigantic, larger than continents. No wonder later readers thought Plato was pulling their leg, but mistranslation didn't only create confusion, also sparked curiosity. Every inconsistency became an excuse for debate. Did Plato mean miles, or did he mean something smaller? Was Atlantis across the Atlantic, or just somewhere in the Mediterranean? Did island really mean peninsula? Historians still argue whether we've ever read his words correctly at all. And then you add the storytellers. For generations, scholars didn't just copy Plato, they commented on him, debated him, argued about him in margins. Some scribes treated the story as historical truth, others dismissed it as allegory. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, Atlantis had become less a single clear tale and more a bundle of overlapping interpretations. You can imagine a medieval monk hunched over a manuscript, candlelight flickering, muttering to himself about whether this Atlantis was a real place or just some pagan metaphor. Maybe he copied it faithfully. Maybe he added a note in the margin. This is nonsense. Either way, the legend survived, drifting like flotsam through the centuries. And here's the irony, you're still in that same situation today. We're piecing together fragments of copies, never quite sure how much is Plato's true voice and how much is centuries of human error. Atlantis might not just be a lost city, it might also be a victim of lost translation. You listen to the waves again, steady and sly, and wonder, what if the island never sank at all? What if it just drowned in the ink of 1,000 scribes' pens? The sound of scratching pens and flickering candlelight fades, and now you're stepping into a new era. It's the Renaissance sails snapping in the wind, compasses pointing west, and explorers convinced the world is theirs to map. For centuries, Atlantis had been a whisper in dusty manuscripts, but suddenly the age of discovery gives it fresh oxygen. If the world is bigger than anyone imagined, maybe, just maybe, Plato's lost island is still out there waiting to be found. You? Picture those early explorers standing on the deck of wooden ships that creak like old bones, staring into endless horizons. The sea was terrifying, but it was also seductive. What secrets lay just beyond? And if Plato's tale of a mighty empire beyond the pillars of Heracles had even a grain of truth, then the Atlantic Ocean itself became a giant treasure hunt. It wasn't just sailors who were obsessed. Renaissance scholars were just as enthralled. They loved rediscovering Greek and Roman texts. And when they stumbled upon Plato's Atlantis, it didn't feel like a bedtime story anymore. Felt like a challenge. What if this wasn't allegory but literal geography? What if the island really had been swallowed by the sea, and all you had to do was go look for it? Here's your quirky tidbit. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus set sail westward, he carried with him not only charts and provisions, but also books referencing Plato and Atlantis. Some of his supporters even argued that the new lands he might find could be remnants of the Atlantean world. Imagine pitching your voyage to the Spanish crown with a straight face. Yes, I'm finding India. Or maybe a mythical sunken island. Either way, it'll be worth it. And it wasn't just Columbus. Thinkers like Francis Bacon later wove Atlantis into their own utopian fantasies. Bacon's New Atlantis, written in the 1600s, described a hidden island society devoted to science, discovery, and progress. It wasn't meant to be taken literally, but it kept the concept alive, shaping Atlantis as not just a lost world of wealth, but also one of wisdom. Historians still argue whether Bacon was riffing on Plato, reinventing him, or just using the name because it sounded exotic and cool. But for the sailors of the Renaissance, it was serious business. They heard Plato's description an island beyond Gibraltar, larger than Libya and Asia combined, and wondered if it matched any of the strange coastlines they were stumbling across. Suddenly, the Caribbean, the Azores, the Canary Islands, even parts of South America were prime candidates. Maps of the period sometimes sketched phantom islands across the Atlantic, little dots of land that cartographers swore were there, until future explorers sailed straight over them and found nothing but waves. Still, belief persisted. If you were a sailor in those days, you'd already seen plenty of things people back home would have sworn impossible: flying fish, boiling seas near volcanoes, storms that appeared from nowhere. Why not a sunken island that sometimes rose back into view? The ocean, after all, was vast and moody, and you could hide anything in its depths. Meanwhile, in salons and universities, the debates continued. Some insisted Atlantis had to be real, pointing to Plato's details. Others scoffed, saying it was just philosophy dressed as geography. Yet the timing was perfect. As Europe stretched across the oceans, it needed stories of discovery and wonder to match its ambitions. Atlantis was more than a myth, was fuel for the imagination, a promise that the sea still held miracles. You lean against the railing of one of those Renaissance ships in your mind. The wood sticky with salt, the stars wheeling overhead. The sailors murmur about gold, strange animals, and maybe, just maybe, a sunken kingdom waiting to rise again. The sails billow, the horizon darkens, and you feel it. Atlantis has become more than Plato's parable. It's now a compass point, a dream to chase, and an excuse to keep pushing into the unknown. The sails of those Renaissance ships keep billowing in your imagination. But now the horizon shifts west toward the New World. By the late 15th and 16th centuries, the Americas were no longer just rumors on maps. Vast continents, filled with unfamiliar landscapes, animals, and people, were suddenly very real. And naturally, Europeans squinted at all this strangeness and thought, hey, maybe this is Atlantis. It wasn't entirely ridiculous from their perspective. Plato said Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar, and here were these enormous new lands across the ocean. To some, it was the smoking gun. Atlantis hadn't sunk. They argued it had simply been hiding in plain sight, waiting for Columbus to stumble into it while looking for India. Spanish chroniclers especially leaned into this idea. When Hernán Cortés marched into the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, he found a city of canals, gleaming temples, and riches beyond imagination. To stunned Europeans, it felt eerily similar to Plato's description. Concentric causeways, shimmering palaces, even markets that buzzed with energy. It was tempting to believe they'd uncovered the fabled island. Never mind that Tenochtitlan wasn't in the ocean, wasn't shaped like rings, and hadn't sunk. It felt Atlantean enough to set imaginations ablaze. Here's a quirky tidbit. One Spanish friar, Francisco López de Gomara, outright claimed in the 16th century that the Americas were Atlantis, insisting Plato's tale was just another name for this newly discovered world. He wasn't alone. Other writers tried to link Inca and Maya civilizations to Atlantean survivors, saying their advanced architecture and astronomy had to be the legacy of a drowned superculture, because, apparently, it was easier to believe in Atlantis than to admit. Indigenous peoples had built greatness all on their own. Historians still argue whether this was genuine belief or just convenient propaganda. After all, If the Americas were Atlantis, then their wealth was practically destined to belong to Spain and Portugal. Claiming divine or mythical precedent was a neat way to justify conquest. It's like saying, no worries, we're not stealing, we're just reclaiming ancient real estate. But not everyone bought it. Some scholars pointed out glaring problems. Atlantis was supposed to sink while the Americas were standing, tall and dry. Others noted that Plato described Atlantis as an island, not a double continent stretching from the Arctic to Patagonia. Still, the allure was too strong. Every ruin, every pyramid, every golden trinket dug up in the Americas became fuel for the Atlantis fire. You wander through this period in your mind. Past conquistadors scribbling letters back to Europe, priests translating Mayan glyphs, and scholars scratching their heads over maps. The obsession with Atlantis was never really about accuracy, was about possibility. And in the age of exploration, possibility was intoxicating. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Ocean itself became a canvas for speculation. If Atlantis wasn't the Americas, maybe it was one of the smaller islands dotting the Sea, the Azores, Madeira, or the Canaries. Sailors returned with tales of strange stone ruins, half buried under vines, and people back home whispered, Atlanteans. Every island could be Atlantis if you squinted hard enough, and yet the mystery deepened. If the Americas weren't Atlantis, then where was it? Under the waves, on some hidden map? Or had it truly never existed at all? That unanswered question kept the legend alive, even as real cities rose and fell before European eyes. You stand again by the waves in your imagination, the same ones Plato might have stared at 2,000 years earlier. The ocean doesn't care about theories, it just keeps rolling in and out. And yet, with every crash of surf, the same thought lingers. What if the Americas really are Atlantis? Not in geography, but in spirit, a reminder of how discovery can blur into myth, and myth can shape the way people see the world. You're still gazing westward in your mind, but now your imagination slides beneath the waves. Because here's the thing, Atlantis isn't the only city said to have drowned. Across history, human settlements have been swallowed by water, shaken apart by earthquakes, or buried under Madand. Those stories blur with Plato's tale in fascinating ways. Take Helic, for instance. In 373 BCE, not long before Plato wrote his dialogues, this Greek city near the Gulf of Corinth was struck by a sudden earthquake. Overnight, the ground cracked, swallowed buildings, and then a tsunami rolled in, pulling the entire city under. For centuries afterward, fishermen claimed they could see Helic's rooftops glimmering beneath the waves. Now that sounds like something that could inspire a myth about a city lost to the sea. Archaeologists later confirmed parts of Helic had indeed been submerged. The coincidence in timing is so striking that some scholars argue Plato must have heard about Helic when shaping his Atlantis story. Historians still argue whether Atlantis was just a dramatized version of this very real disaster. Then there's Thonis Heracleion, an Egyptian port city that thrived in antiquity, forgotten for over 1,000 years until divers stumbled across its ruins in the early 2000s. Temples, colossal statues, even stone inscriptions were found scattered across the seabed near the Nile Delta. The city had been swallowed by shifting soil and the sea around the 8th century CE. Suddenly, what sounded like fantasy, an entire metropolis hidden underwater, was proven entirely possible. And Helic and Thonis aren't alone. Legends ripple across cultures. The Welsh talk of Cantro Gweled, a sunken kingdom off their coast. The Indians tell of Dwarka, Lord Krishna's city, said to vanish beneath the Arabian Sea. In Japan, fishermen whisper of Yanaguni, strange step-like formations beneath the waves that some insist are ancient ruins. You probably won't survive a night dive there, by the way, not because of Atlantis, but because strong currents might make you fish food. A quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, some British explorers visiting India insisted Dwarka must be Atlantis in disguise. Never mind that Dwarka's religious history had nothing to do with Plato. They just loved stitching together far-flung myths. Atlantis had become less of a single story and more of a choose-your-own-adventure mystery board, with pins scattered across the globe. But each of these real sunken cities serves as a reminder. The idea of entire civilizations slipping beneath the water isn't pure fantasy. Nature has done it before, and it will do it again. Earthquakes, rising seas, shifting coastlines, they're all brutal reminders that nothing we build is permanent. The ocean takes what it wants. Still, Atlantis stands apart. Unlike hell-like, or Thonisura Clayan, no diver has ever come up with a marble column labeled property of Atlanteans. No submerged temple has matched Plato's precise description. And that gap, the absence of proof, keeps the story floating. Neither entirely real nor entirely dismissed. As you picture these ruins lying silent in their watery tombs, you can almost hear the sea whispering. It's as if history itself hides just below the surface, daring you to dive deeper. You can see why Atlantis refuses to sink from memory, because if Hellike was real, if Thonis was real, if Dwarka might have been real, then maybe, just maybe, Atlantis waits too. And while scholars debate whether Plato spun a parable or borrowed from true events, you feel the pull of that mystery. You drift in your thoughts between myth and archaeology, listening for echoes of cities that once thrummed with life, but now sleep in the deep. You drift further along the shoreline in your mind. And now, the modern world creeps in clipboards, microscopes, sonar maps, and patient scientists with their cautious frowns. The story of Atlantis, once just an echo of Plato's voice, eventually collided with geology and archaeology. And honestly, you can almost picture those first scholars rolling their eyes. All right, folks, let's measure some rocks before we declare we've found the lost continent. Science steps in with a sharper lens. Suddenly, questions shift from where did Plato mean to what natural disasters could have inspired him. One of the strongest candidates: tsunamis. If you've ever seen footage of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami or Japan's 2011 quake, you know how merciless a wall of water can be. Entire cities flattened, whole coastlines rearranged. Atlantis could easily have been the memory of some catastrophic wave scrawled into myth. Historians still argue whether Plato's story fits that model. But the destructive parallels are chilling. Volcanoes, too, earn their suspects list. Earth's crust is restless, and nowhere more so than in the Mediterranean. Think about it. Eruptions can obliterate civilizations in a single violent night. Ash, lava, and quakes could sink ports, destroy fleets, and erase farmland in an instant. You probably won't survive standing too close to a blast zone, unless you're a marshmallow hoping for the world's deadliest single quotes. More geology even has a term, catastrophism, to describe how sudden disasters reshape landscapes. For centuries, people assumed change was always slow and steady. Then scientists looked at layers of rock, saw evidence of sudden upheaval, and thought, maybe sometimes the Earth throws tantrums. Atlantis fits neatly into that tantrum-shaped hole. And don't forget climate change, not our modern version, but the ancient dance of ice ages and rising seas. Around 12,000 years ago, glaciers melted at a terrifying pace. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet, drowning coastal settlements worldwide. Some researchers whisper, could Plato's 9,000 years actually be a garbled memory of those very floods? After all, oral traditions stretch back further than we once believed. Then there's plate tectonics, land rising, land sinking, earthquakes, splitting ground. The Mediterranean and Atlantic are restless crossroads. If any civilization thrived near those fault lines, it wouldn't take much for nature to rewrite their map. You can almost hear the groan of shifting plates beneath your feet as you imagine a harbor cracking in half. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. In the 20th century, one theory suggested Atlantis had actually sunk because of a rare geological phenomenon called liquefaction, where soil turns into something like quicksand during an earthquake. Picture an entire palace wobbling, then sinking like a spoon in pudding. It sounds cartoonish, but soil really does that under the right stress. Science doesn't just poke holes, it sometimes makes the myth eerily plausible. Every flood layer, every drowned ruin, every volcanic scar on the Earth's skin gives Plato's tale a new way to breathe. The catch, of course, is that for every promising clue, skeptics raise their eyebrows. If Atlantis was real, they ask, why no definitive artifacts? Why no unambiguous ruins? Why only Plato and no Greek neighbor backing up his claim? And yet, when you combine Helix earthquake, there's eruption, the endless tsunamis, and rising seas, you start to see how Atlantis could be a collage stitched together from very real disasters. Maybe Plato wasn't inventing out of thin air, but blending cautionary tales with whispers of memory. Historians still argue whether the myth is history's most creative fable or its oldest. Disaster report. The waves crash in your imagination, and you feel the weight of science, not as a killjoy, but as a grounding force. Atlantis, through their eyes, becomes less a city of gold-tipped temples and more a mirror held up to nature's fury. And as you listen to that mirror shatter in your thoughts, you realize the myth survives, not because it's proven, but because it feels possible. Your feet crunch in the volcanic gravel of an island that once roared like an angry god, Thera, or, as we call it today, Santorini. You picture its crescent shape from above, a broken ring surrounding a vast caldera filled with the sea. To the casual tourist, it looks idyllic: whitewashed houses, blue domes, lazy cats napping in the sun. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the deep memory of one of the most violent eruptions in human history. Historians still argue whether this Bronze Age blast could be the true root of Plato's Atlantis. Around 1600 BC, give or take a generation, Thera erupted with a force that makes Mount Vesuvius look like a kid sneezing on a birthday cake. The explosion blasted ash across the eastern Mediterranean, darkened skies, and sent tsunamis racing outward. Imagine being a sailor in a wooden ship as a wall of water higher than your mast bore down. Yeah, you probably wouldn't survive that one at the time. This island was home to the Minoan civilization, one of Europe's earliest advanced cultures. They had palaces, writing systems, plumbing that would make medieval towns jealous, and a flair for decorating walls with dolphins and lilies. When Thera erupted, it wasn't just the island that suffered. It likely crippled the Minoans' trade network and left Crete vulnerable to decline. To later storytellers, watching a glittering society vanish into the sea might have sounded suspiciously like Atlantis. Archaeologists digging through Akrotiri, the buried Minoan town on Santorini, found streets, frescoes, and even jars of food sealed in volcanic debris. It's a snapshot frozen in time, almost like Pompeii's cousin, except older and missing the tourist gift shops. The ash preserved not just walls, but details of daily life: beds, tools, painted rooms where children once played. Walking through it in your imagination, you sense the eerie stillness, as though the city was paused mid-sentence. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some scientists believe the eruption might have inspired the biblical tale of plagues in Egypt. Ash clouds, red waters, and strange weather anomalies fit suspiciously well. Atlantis, Exodus, natural disaster, they might all overlap like an ancient Venn diagram of chaos. The eruption's power also rewrote maps. Parts of the island simply disappeared, swallowed by the sea. Massive quakes rocked the Aegean, while tsunamis smashed Crete's northern coast. Ships, harbors, and fleets could have been destroyed overnight. To survivors, it must have felt like divine punishment. You can see how that memory, handed down over centuries, could morph into a story of gods punishing arrogant Atlanteans. But, as always, skeptics frown. They point out that Plato set Atlantis far west, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, not in Greece's backyard. And the timeline 9,000 years before Plato doesn't quite match Thera's eruption. Unless, of course, those numbers were symbolic, exaggerated, or garbled in translation. You can almost hear a philosopher saying, "Hey, what's a few thousand years between friends?" What makes Santorini so seductive as an Atlantis candidate is how perfectly it blends fact and myth. A real, advanced society destroyed by sudden catastrophe. Evidence we can walk through today. And yet, no golden temples, no mysterious elephant herds, no massive concentric canals. Just quiet ruins under layers of ash, waiting for tourists to shuffle by in sandals and snap Instagram photos. Still, the island whispers. Its broken crescent, its buried frescoes, its memory afire, and see all of it feels like a puzzle piece that almost fits the story Plato left us. Almost, but not quite. And maybe that not quite is what keeps Atlantis alive, forcing you to imagine, to wonder, to dream while the waves crash outside your window. Your sandals sink into warm desert sand as you glance down at a map that looks more like a conspiracy board than a geography lesson. The lines are jagged, the arrows frantic, the circles drawn in red ink with way too much confidence. This is where things get wild. Alternative maps of Atlantis. Because if you thought Santorini was a stretch, wait until you hear about Antarctica, the Sahara, and, yes, even outer space. The Antarctica theory is probably the boldest. Proponents claim that under its mile-thick ice sheet lies a forgotten continent-sized civilization. The idea got traction in the mid-20th century with the so-called Piri Reis Mappa real artifact from 1513, showing parts of the world known to Turkish sailors. Some enthusiasts swear it depicts Antarctica without ice. Historians still argue whether this is even possible, since humans didn't exactly have satellites or Google Earth back then. Mainstream scholars say the map simply shows South America with artistic liberties. But alternative history buffs wave the ancient maps knew more than we do flag with gusto. Then there's the Sahara. Picture standing at the rich ITA structure. In Mauritania, massive eye-shaped geological formation visible from space. Locals call it the Eye of the Sahara, and conspiracy theorists call it Atlantis. Its concentric rings eerily echo Plato's description of Atlantis' circular canals. You almost want to squint and see the temples, the markets, the elephants grazing between the rings. Geologists, on the other hand, yawn and explain that the structure formed naturally through erosion. But if you're in the mood for wonder, that doesn't stop you from daydreaming about chariots rumbling across the sand where only camels tread now. And if land theories feel too tame, some writers fling Atlantis right off the planet. Yes, outer space. The notion goes that Atlanteans weren't human at all, but extraterrestrials, who either founded or abandoned Earth. That explains, according to fringe lore, why so many ancient structures, pyramids, Stonehenge, Nazca lines line up with star charts. Here's the quirky tidbit. In the 1970s, one author even suggested that the Bermuda Triangle was a malfunctioning Atlantean energy device left behind by spacefaring ancestors. Suddenly, missing airplanes sound less like accidents and more like the world's rudest lost dash and dash found, of course. If Plato heard all this, he might roll his eyes so hard he'd sprain a muscle. His Atlantis was supposed to be a moral fable about hubris, not a Where's Waldo cosmic treasure hunt. But humans can't resist filling in blanks with imagination. The vaguer the clue, the wider the playground. Standing between all these theories, you feel the tension. Geology versus mythology, reason versus fantasy. Some archaeologists patiently catalog ruins, while others sigh as tourists ask them about aliens. Yet you can't deny the allure. A frozen continent hiding secrets, a desert eye staring back at satellites, a cosmic origin that makes you wonder. If bedtime stories stretch beyond the stars as you fold up your wrinkled map, you notice every theory shares the same heartbeat, the longing for a perfect world lost, waiting to be rediscovered. Whether it's buried under ice, sand, or cosmic. Dust Atlantis is less about where it was and more about where our minds will wander when given the chance. Your pillow feels softer now, but your mind is buzzing with neon lights, TV jingles, and paperback covers. Atlantis has officially left the quiet halls of philosophy and stormed into the messy, glittering world of pseudoscience and pop culture. And you're right in the middle of it, browsing through old paperbacks at a thrift store or catching a late-night rerun of some B-movie with glowing crystal pyramids. Let's start with the crystals. Atlantis and crystals go together like peanut butter and jelly. If jelly could supposedly power laser beams. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fringe spiritualists claimed the Atlanteans had mastered crystal energy. They imagined skyscraper-sized quartz towers beaming power wirelessly across the land, or even regulating the weather. One quirky tidbit. A psychic in the 1930s claimed to have been an Atlantean priest in a past life and warned that crystal misuse once blew up half the island. That's a heck of a way to explain climate change, right? Meanwhile, mainstream historians are just rubbing their temples. Historians still argue whether Plato intended Atlantis as a literal place or just an allegory, but they definitely don't argue about Atlantean laser towers. Still, those ideas were catnip for authors, especially in the age of pulp magazines. By the mid-20th century, Atlantis was starring in comic books. Marvel made it the underwater home of Namor, the Submariner, a broody anti-hero who basically spends his time flipping between helping humans and flooding their cities. DC Comics. They gave us Aquaman cheerful, heroic, and rocking a trident, like a surfer's spear. Atlantis, suddenly, wasn't just a lost civilization. It was a superhero HQ, and then came Disney, rolling in like a cheerful elephant into a crystal shop. Their animated movie, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, turned the myth into a steampunk adventure with submarines, floating crystals, and a princess with impeccable hair despite thousands of years underground. It didn't exactly top the box office, but it sealed Atlantis into the childhood imagination of millions. Somewhere, Plato's ghost is muttering, "That's not what I meant at all," while a kid is doodling Atlantean hovercraft in math class. It doesn't stop there. Atlantis has cameoed in video games, TV shows, novels, even reality TV specials with dramatic announcers promising shocking new evidence that usually ends in, well, more dramatic music. The quirkier the theory, the higher the ratings. And yet, beneath the laughter and popcorn, the story keeps tugging at you. Atlantis in pop culture reflects a collective longing, a wish for hidden wisdom, secret technology, or proof that humans once had it all before messing it up. It's the ultimate bedtime story for adults, a myth that keeps rewriting itself with each generation's toys, fears, and jokes. You yawn, realizing the funny thing. The Atlantis you grew up with probably says more about your time than about any Bronze Age island. But that's the magic of myths. They're mirrors, dressed as mysteries. You stretch under the covers and realize that, somehow, Atlantis has survived more than 2,000 years of reinterpretation without ever producing a single barnacle-encrusted brick as proof. And yet, the dream of it refuses to drown. Why? Maybe because humans are wired to crave golden ages. The idea that once upon a time, things were better, richer, and more magical than they are now. Think about it, Atlantis is basically the ultimate nostalgia trip, except instead of missing the 90s or your favorite Saturday morning cartoons, you're missing an entire civilization that supposedly had flying ships, miracle harvests, and architecture gleaming like gold. One mainstream fact is that nearly every major culture has some myth of a lost paradise. The Greeks had Elysium, the Mesopotamians had Dilmun, and the Hebrews had Eden. Atlantis fits neatly into that psychological groove. We can't help but imagine that behind us is a shining past, not just rubble. And then there's the moral angle. Remember, Plato didn't describe Atlantis as a happy ever-after kingdom meant collapsed because of arrogance, greed, and hubris. Historians still argue whether he designed it as a warning story for his fellow Athenians. A way of saying, don't get too full of yourselves or you'll end up like these guys. That sort of tale never really expires. Swap in different costumes, Romans, Victorians. Maybe us doom-scrolling on our phones, then the moral still clicks. Civilizations fall when they lose their balance. A quirky little tidbit. In the 19th century, one spiritualist writer claimed Atlanteans invented airplanes, but instead of using them for exploration, they turned them into war machines. He basically foreshadowed modern drone strikes, except with more feathers and hieroglyphics. But Atlantis isn't only a cautionary tale. It's also hope. Maybe, just maybe, hidden somewhere in the Sahara or beneath the Atlantic, there's proof that humans can achieve greatness beyond what we imagine now. The myth whispers, you're capable of more. You're part of a longer story than you realize. That's why writers, dreamers, and late-night YouTube hosts keep retelling it. You find yourself lulled by the rhythm of waves in your imagination. Picturing Atlantis not as a literal place anymore, but as a symbol that floats on the ocean of human imagination. You've seen it in crystals, comic books, and Disney princesses, but what it really reflects is your own longing for meaning and mystery. And as you sink deeper into the pillows, you can admit, whether Atlantis existed or not, almost doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that it still makes you wonder. The hum of your fan is steady now, like ocean waves lapping against some unseen shore. And you realize this is the last stretch of our wandering through the myth of Atlantis. You've trekked across Plato's writings, squinted at maps of the Atlantic, trudged through dusty ruins, and even flipped through comic book sand. Yet the island itself has never once appeared beneath your feet. It remains exactly where it started. In the liminal space between imagination and memory, mainstream historians remind you of a simple fact. No credible archaeological site has ever been identified as Atlantis. There's not a single shard of pottery you can hold up and say, yup, this was Plato's lost utopia. And yet, people keep digging. From sonar sweeps of the ocean floor to satellites scanning the deserts of Mauritania, the hunt never stops. Historians still argue whether these searches are noble scientific curiosity or just human stubbornness, refusing to let go of a good story. And then there are the quirky detours. The claims that Atlantis was really Antarctica before the ice, or that it sank under the Bermuda Triangle, swallowed whole by magnetic anomalies and disgruntled dolphins. You have to admire the creativity, even if the evidence is mostly, well, vibes. But here's the interesting thing. Atlantis endures, not because of facts, but because of feelings. It's a cultural mirror, reflecting back whatever an era most wants or fears. For Plato, it was a cautionary tale about hubris. For 19th century romantics, it was a symbol of lost wisdom. For Marvel and Disney, it was an exotic stage for adventure. And for you, lying here in the dim quiet, it's a lullaby for the imagination and ocean you can swim in without leaving your pillow. Maybe the real Atlantis is less about a sunken city and more about the part of your brain that never stops searching for hidden doors. The part that still wonders if tomorrow might uncover something breathtaking. something that rewrites everything we think we know. So now, let's slow it all down. The waves that carried us through temples, maps, and myths begin to settle into long, gentle swells. The lights of Atlantis, whether they were ever real or only imagined, fade into a soft glow in the distance. Like lanterns bobbing on a dark sea, your breathing finds its own rhythm, steady and unhurried, like the tide flowing in and out. The questions that seemed so sharp earlier, was it myth? Was it memory? Was it something in between? Begin to blur, losing their edges. They don't need answers tonight. Not everything does. Instead, you can let yourself drift into that warm, twilight space where possibilities feel endless. If Atlantis was only a story, then it proves the power of imagination, strong enough to ripple across millennia. And if it was ever real, then perhaps there are still wonders hidden in this wide world, waiting quietly until the right moment. Either way, the thought itself is soothing, an invitation to wonder. But not to worry. The rise and fall of civilizations, the myths that outlast them, the whispers of the sea, they all fold together now into something softer, almost like a lullaby. The fan hums, the room is dim, and your body feels heavier with each passing breath. There's no need to hold on anymore. You can let go of the story, let go of the search, and allow the gentle waves of sleep to carry you wherever you need to. Go, Atlantis can wait. For now, there is only calm water, quiet air, and the simple, safe comfort of rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.